February 12, 1945. Defensive position along the Oder River, 80 kilometers east of Berlin. 16-year-old Hans Weber cradles a weapon that looks like it was assembled in an automotive repair shop. The receiver is spot-welded sheet metal, not milled steel. The stock is rough beechwood, barely sanded, with splinters catching his palms. The sights are fixed, crudely stamped metal, non-adjustable, zeroed for 100 meters only. The serial number, stamped on the wooden stock, reads TH8895. TH for Thuringia, the state whose Gauleiter ordered these weapons, not the Wehrmacht. This is the Gustloff Volkssturm VG 1-5. Weight, 4.5 kilograms loaded. Barrel length, 379 millimeters. Rate of fire, semi-automatic only. Magazine capacity, 30 rounds of 7.92 by 33 millimeter Kurds ammunition. The same intermediate cartridge as the STG-44 assault rifle, because Germany can no longer afford to produce multiple ammunition types. Weber is not a soldier. He's a member of the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, a national militia conscripted on October 18, 1944, from boys aged 16 to 60 and men previously rejected for military service or recovering from wounds. He received 2 weeks of training. Most of that time was spent learning how to operate the Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. The Volkssturmgewehr he holds? He fired it once during training. Once. The weapon in his hands was designed in late 1944 by Karl Barnitsky of Gustloff VG under the Primitiv-Waffen-Programm, the Primitive Weapons Program. It contains only 39 metal parts, 12 of which require milling. Everything else is stamped sheet metal, springs, rivets, and screws. It can be assembled in small workshops by unskilled labor using material salvaged from automotive factories. It is crude. It is simple. It is what desperation looks like when stamped into sheet metal and handed to children to defend a collapsing empire. Across the frozen Oder River, Soviet forces are massing. They carry PPSH-41 submachine guns, 6 million produced over 4 years. The Red Army has tanks, artillery, air support, and soldiers who've been fighting since 1941. Weber has a sheet metal rifle that was designed 3 months ago, a Panzerfaust with 1 shot and orders to hold the line. He will die on this riverbank. His Volkssturmgewehr will be recovered by Soviet forces, examined, photographed, and sent to Moscow as evidence of Germany's complete industrial collapse. That weapon, serial number TH8895, survived the war. Weber didn't. This is the story of how Germany's weapons designers created firearms from scraps when precision manufacturing was no longer possible, when skilled machinists were dead or drafted, when steel was scarce and time had run out. It's the story of the Primitiv-Waffen-Programm, the last-ditch effort to arm an entire militia using sheet metal, spot welds, and engineering genius born from desperation. By autumn 1944, Germany's strategic situation was catastrophic. The Soviets had liberated Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and stood at the borders of East Prussia. American and British forces had liberated France and were approaching the Rhine. Italy had switched sides. Romania had switched sides. Finland had switched sides. Germany's allies were gone, its territory was shrinking, and its armed forces were bleeding from unsustainable casualties. The Wehrmacht had lost entire armies. At Stalingrad in 1943, 300,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. In the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, 50,000 more were killed or captured. In Operation Bagraton, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, German Army Group Center ceased to exist. 28 divisions destroyed, 450,000 casualties. Replacements couldn't match losses. Young men were being conscripted at 17, sent to the front with minimal training and dying before they'd fired 100 rounds in practice. Veteran divisions that once fielded 15,000 men were operating at 4,000, 5,000 strength. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel and pilots. The Navy was bottled up in port. And Berlin faced an existential question. What happens when the Red Army reaches German soil? Adolf Hitler's answer, announced on September 25, 1944, and formally established on October 18, 1944, was the Deutscher Volkssturm, the German People's Storm, a national militia mobilizing all German males aged 16 to 60 not already serving in the armed forces. This wasn't a volunteer force. This was total conscription of everyone who could hold a rifle: teenage boys, grandfathers, wounded veterans deemed unfit for frontline service, factory workers, office clerks, teachers, farmers. Approximately 6 million men were conscripted into the Volkssturm by war's end, though actual mobilization never exceeded 1.5 million simultaneously. The problem: Germany didn't have weapons for them. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS had first claim on all modern firearms. What remained was a hodgepodge of obsolete rifles, captured foreign weapons, and whatever could be scraped together from storage depots. The Volkssturm battalions forming in October-November 1944 had one rifle for every 3 men. The only solution: design and manufacture new weapons using whatever materials and manufacturing capacity remained. Steel was scarce, prioritized for tanks, aircraft, and naval construction. Precision machining was impossible. Skilled machinists were dead, drafted, or working on priority projects. Traditional firearms manufacturing was out of the question. What remained was stamping: sheet metal, spot welding, rivets. The same techniques used to manufacture automotive body panels, metal furniture, and agricultural equipment. If Volkswagen could stamp out body panels for thousands of vehicles using unskilled labor, could firearms be manufactured the same way? In late 1944, the German High Command initiated the Primitiv-Waffen-Programm, the Primitive Weapons Program. The requirements were explicit: design rifles and pistols that could be produced quickly in non-specialized factories by unskilled workers using minimal steel and requiring almost no precision machining. 5 major arms manufacturers submitted designs: Walter, Spraywerk Berlin, Rheinmetall, Mauser, and Steyr. Each was designated Volksgewehr, People's Rifle, with sequential numbers VG1 through VG5. A 6th designer, Karl Barnitzky of Gustloff VG, submitted a radical semi-automatic design that would become the most produced Volkssturm weapon, the Gustloff Volkssturmgewehr VG1 through 5. The Volksgewehr designs shared common characteristics: simplified bolt actions, fixed sights, minimal machining, maximum use of stampings and forgings, crude finish, and desperate economy. The Volkssturmgewehr VG1, developed by Walther at their Zelle Mehlis facility, was perhaps the most refined of the bolt-action Volksgewehr. It used a simple rotating bolt with 2 frontal lugs for locking. The bolt handle engaged a cut in the cast steel receiver for additional safety. The feed system used detachable 10-round box magazines, originally developed for the Gewehr 43 semi-automatic rifle. The manual safety was crude: a stamped steel lever pinned to the trigger guard behind the trigger. When engaged, it blocked trigger movement. Disengaging required turning it sideways with a finger. Awkward, slow, but functional. The stock was rough beechwood. Non-adjustable iron sights provided for close-range shooting only. No graduations, no windage adjustment, just a simple notch and post zeroed for approximately 100 meters. Production was assigned to Zbrojova Brno in occupied Czechoslovakia. Approximately 10,000 VG1 rifles may have been produced before the factory was captured by Soviet forces in spring 1945. The Volkssturmgewehr VG2, developed by Spreework Berlin, was mechanically similar to the VG1, manually operated bolt action with rotating bolt and crude manual safety. It shared the Gewehr 43's 10-round detachable box magazines. The receiver was stamped steel, spot-welded at seams. The stock was even cruder than the VG1, rough wood with virtually no finishing. Fixed sights, zeroed for 100 meters. Approximately 16,000 to 18,000 VG2 rifles were believed produced primarily in Berlin area factories between January and April 1945. Rheinmetall's design departed from the others by chambering the 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz intermediate cartridge, the same round used in the STG-44 assault rifle. This allowed use of the STG-44's 30-round detachable box magazines, giving the VG3 3 times the magazine capacity of the VG1 and VG2. The VG3 used a tube receiver made from stamped sheet metal with simple forgings, spot welds, and rivets. One-piece beechwood furniture. Weight, approximately 3.1 kilograms unloaded. Overall length, 86 centimeters. But the war ended before serial production could begin. Fewer than 50 VG3 rifles were produced, mostly prototypes. Only 1 or 2 examples survived the war. One grainy photograph exists showing a VG3 with its bolt missing. Mauser's design could be chambered for either 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz or standard 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser ammunition. It featured an internal magazine fed by 5-round stripper clips, the same loading method as the Karabiner 98K. This was the most conservative design, essentially a simplified K98K with stamped parts replacing milled components wherever possible. The advantage, logistics officers were familiar with the system. The disadvantage, limited magazine capacity. Fewer than 10 VG40 rifles were produced. The design simply arrived too late. By the time prototypes were ready, Germany's manufacturing capacity had collapsed. The VG5, more correctly designated Volkssturm Karabiner VK98, was the crudest of all 5 designs. It used a Gewehr 98 type bolt action with rotary bolt, but had no magazine. Every cartridge had to be manually loaded into the chamber, making it a single-shot rifle. The sights were fixed and non-adjustable. The stock was minimally worked wood. Some examples had a magazine well present, suggesting the design could potentially accept a 5-round internal magazine, but most were manufactured as single-shot weapons. The VK98 could be manufactured entirely in small workshops using hand tools and minimal machinery. This was its advantage. Any machine shop could produce them. Its disadvantage, a single-shot bolt-action rifle in 1945 was essentially useless for anything except positional defense. Production numbers are unknown, possibly hundreds, possibly low thousands. Quality varied wildly depending on which workshop produced them. While the 5 Volksgewehr designs were bolt-action rifles, Karl Berninski's Gustloff Volkssturmgewehr VG1-5 was something different, a semi-automatic rifle using gas-delayed blowback operation. This was not a simple design. It was elegant engineering masquerading as crude manufacture. Most semi-automatic rifles use gas-operated or recoil-operated mechanisms requiring complex parts and precise tolerances. The VG1-5 used neither. Instead, Barnitsky adapted a gas-delayed blowback system that was simple enough to manufacture with stamped parts, but sophisticated enough to work reliably. Here's how it worked. The barrel was surrounded by a hollow reciprocating sleeve. When the weapon fired, propellant gases vented through ports 65 millimeters from the muzzle into the annular space between barrel and sleeve. The gas pressure pushed against the sleeve, holding it forward against the bolt. This delayed the bolt's opening by a few milliseconds, just long enough for the bullet to exit the barrel and pressure to drop to safe levels. Once pressure decreased, the bolt could move rearward, extract the spent case, cock the hammer, and cycle the action. A return spring pushed the bolt forward, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and chambering it. The system was elegant because it required minimal parts: a barrel, a hollow sleeve, gas ports, and a bolt. No gas piston, no rotating bolt, no locking lugs, just gas pressure temporarily resisting bolt movement. The advantage? The system required precise gas port size and positioning. Too small, and the bolt would open prematurely, causing extraction failures or case ruptures. Too large, and the action wouldn't cycle properly. The barrel and sleeve also had to be machined to close tolerances, approximately 0.5 millimeters clearance, or the sleeve would bind when the barrel heated and expanded. In late 1944, achieving such precision in German factories was increasingly difficult. Allied bombing had destroyed precision machinery. Skilled machinists were scarce. Quality control was minimal. Many VG-1-5 rifles suffered from jamming, failures to extract, and sleeve binding due to poor manufacturing tolerances. Production of the Gustloff Volkssturm Gewehr began in January 1945 at the Gustloff VG facility in Suhl, Thuringia. The weapon was initially designated MP507, Machine and Pistola 507. A variant with a pistol grip was designated MP508. Some versions offered select fire capability, both semi-automatic and fully automatic modes, though most were semi-automatic only. Approximately 10,000 VG-1-5 rifles were produced between January and May 1945. This is a conservative estimate. Exact production figures were lost when the factory was captured by Soviet forces in April 1945. The rifles were marked only with serial numbers and the TH prefix indicating they were produced under the authority of the Gauleiter of Thuringia. No Wehrmacht acceptance stamps, Waffenamt marks, appear on any known examples because the German military never officially adopted the Volkssturm Gewehr. These were weapons ordered by local Nazi Party officials for the Volkssturm militia, not military issue. Soviet testing after the war revealed the VG-1-5's limitations. At 100 meters, 50% of shots landed in a circle with 10.2 centimeter radius, approximately 4 inches. At 300 meters, that expanded to 25 centimeters, 9.8 inches. The fixed 100-meter sights meant the bullet dropped approximately 84 centimeters below line of sight at 300 meters, requiring significant overhaul for longer shots. For comparison, a K98K rifle could achieve 5-centimeter groups at 100 meters and remained effective to 500-plus meters with proper sight adjustment. The VG-1-5 was designed for close-range combat only: urban warfare, defensive positions, ambushes in forests. Engagements rarely exceeded 100 meters. At those ranges, the VG-1-5's crude sights and mediocre accuracy were adequate.
Photographs from February-March 1945 show Volkssturm units defending the Oder River and Berlin's approaches. The images are jarring: teenagers in oversized Wehrmacht greatcoats, old men in civilian clothes with armbands, wounded veterans missing limbs, all armed with a mixture of obsolete rifles, captured weapons, and crude Volksgewehr. These were not soldiers. These were civilians, conscripted by force, given minimal training, handed sheet metal rifles, and told to stop the Red Army. Many Volkssturm units had no uniforms. They wore civilian clothes with armbands. Some had no helmets. Many had no winter clothing despite February temperatures below freezing. They lacked radios, medical supplies, ammunition reserves, and food. Some units were given one Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon for every 3 men and told to share. Training was minimal to non-existent. The VG-1-5's semi-automatic operation was relatively complex. Loading magazines, charging the action, understanding how the gas-delayed blowback worked. Many Volkssturm recruits had never fired any weapon before. They didn't understand how to clear malfunctions, how to maintain the rifle, or how to use cover effectively. The results were predictable. When Soviet forces attacked Volkssturm positions, the undertrained militia was slaughtered. Some units broke and fled immediately. Others fought with desperate courage and were annihilated. Soviet forces showed little mercy. Volkssturm units were composed of German civilians defending German soil, and the Red Army had fought through 4 years of brutal warfare to reach Germany. Hans Weber, the 16-year-old introduced at the beginning, represents thousands of teenagers conscripted into the Volkssturm in late 1944. They were given 2 weeks of training, a crude rifle, and orders to hold positions against veteran Soviet troops. Most died. Some surrendered and spent years in Soviet labor camps. A few survived to return to a Germany that no longer existed.
The Primitiv-Waffen-Programm also included pistol designs. The Volkspistole, People's Pistol, was intended to arm Volkssturm officers and provide a sidearm for soldiers whose primary weapon was the Panzerfaust. The Volkspistole used a delayed blowback system similar to the VG-1-5. The barrel was fixed to the frame and surrounded by a slide forming an annular chamber. Gas vents led into this chamber, and high-pressure gas held the slide, and thus the breech closed briefly after firing. Only a few prototypes were produced. The makers are unknown, as record-keeping in Germany in early 1945 had collapsed. The war ended before production could begin. The Volkspistole represents the desperation that characterized German weapons development in the final months. Even pistols were being redesigned for simplified manufacture using stamped parts and gas delay systems that required minimal machining. By April 1945, Soviet forces had encircled Berlin. Volkssturm units, armed with Volksgewehr, Panzerfausts, and obsolete rifles, defended makeshift barricades while the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS held key positions. The VG-15 saw combat in Berlin's streets. Photographs exist showing dead Volkssturm soldiers with Gustloff Volkssturmgewehr rifles beside them. Soviet forces captured hundreds of examples, which were shipped to Moscow for technical evaluation. The rifles performed as designed. They fired semi-automatically at close range. They were unreliable in sustained combat. They jammed from fouling when hot, and they were operated by untrained militia who didn't understand the weapon's limitations. But none of that mattered. The VG-15, the 5 Volksgewehr designs, the Volkspistole, all represented Germany's final desperate attempt to arm a militia that couldn't change the war's outcome. By April 1945, Germany had lost. The Red Army outnumbered, outgunned, and outfought the Volkssturm. Crude sheet metal rifles couldn't stop T-34 tanks, Katyusha rockets, and veteran infantry armed with PPSH-41 submachine guns. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. On May 2, 1945, Berlin surrendered. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945.
The Primitiv-Waffen-Programm represents a unique chapter in firearms history. What happens when advanced industrial nations collapse but continue fighting? Germany in 1944-45 faced constraints that would have been unimaginable in 1939. Steel production had collapsed from Allied bombing and loss of captured territories. Skilled machinists were dead, wounded, or fighting at the front. Precision machinery had been destroyed in air raids. Transportation networks were shattered. Quality control was impossible. Time had run out. Under these conditions, German engineers demonstrated remarkable creativity. The VG-1-5's gas-delayed blowback system was genuinely innovative, a clever solution to semi-automatic operation without complex locking mechanisms. The extensive use of stampings, spot welds, and simple forgings showed that firearms could be manufactured with automotive production techniques when traditional methods weren't available. But Innovation born from desperation is still desperation. The Volksgewehr and Volkssturmgewehr were crude because Germany had no capacity for refinement. They were simple because complexity was impossible. They were produced in small numbers because even simplified production exceeded Germany's remaining capacity. Total Volkssturm weapons production. VG1, Walther, see approximately 10,000. VG2, Spreework, 16 to 18,000. VG3, Rheinmetall, less than 50. VG4, Mauser, less than 10. VG5, VK98, Steyr, unknown, possibly hundreds to low thousands. VG1-5, Gustloff, approximately 10,000. Volkspistol, prototypes only. Total, approximately 40 to 50,000 weapons from the Primitiv-Waffen-Programm. Compare that to Soviet PPSH-41 production, 6 million submachine guns between 1941 and 1947. Or American M1 Garand production, approximately 5.4 million rifles between 1936 and 1957. Germany produced 40,000 crude last-ditch weapons in the final 6 months of the war. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough.
The Gustloff Volkssturmgewehr VG-15, serial number Th8895, resides today in a museum collection, one of perhaps 200 surviving examples worldwide. It's a reminder of what desperation looks like when stamped into sheet metal. The weapon in that museum represents Karl Barnitzka's engineering cleverness, gas-delayed blowback requiring minimal machining, Germany's industrial collapse, spot welds and rough wood instead of milled receivers and finished stocks, the Volkssturm's tragedy, untrained teenagers handed crude rifles and told to stop veteran armies, the war's inevitable conclusion. Innovation couldn't overcome overwhelming material and numerical disadvantages. Hans Weber, the 16-year-old conscript introduced at the beginning, didn't survive. Most Volkssturm soldiers didn't. They were undertrained, under-equipped, and fighting for a cause that was already lost. Their sheet metal rifles couldn't stop T-34 tanks. Their Panzerfausts couldn't halt Soviet artillery. Their courage, and many fought with desperate courage, couldn't change mathematics. The Primitiv-Waffen-Programm demonstrated that firearms could be manufactured under catastrophic conditions using simplified designs and minimal materials. It proved that stamped steel construction could produce functional weapons when precision machining was unavailable. It showed that gas-delayed blowback systems could enable semi-automatic operation without complex locking mechanisms. But it also demonstrated the limits of engineering when facing industrial, numerical, and strategic collapse. Germany could design clever weapons. It could manufacture them in small numbers. It could arm militia units with crude rifles. It couldn't win a war it had already lost. The VG-15 and its Volksgewehr cousins were weapons born from desperation, manufactured under collapse, and issued to soldiers who never should have been soldiers. They represent the final chapter of German weapons development in World War II, not the precision-engineered Mauser rifles of 1939, not the revolutionary STG-44 assault rifles of 1943, but crude sheet metal rifles handed to children in 1945.